So it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Di Vittorio. Alan Di Vittorio is a research scientist at Berkeley Labs, and his connections to Berkeley actually go back to his college and then PhD years. Alan is going to present his work within the E3SM project within the Earth, Human and Earth System Feedbacks group about coupling E3SM with GCAM. And I just want to mention the fact that this work is very much aligned with Alan's general interest in exploring the connections and interactions and feedbacks between the human sphere and the environmental sphere. And he does that at a range of scales, not just at the coarse global scale that we are going to be hearing soon, but using tools like satellite imagery and field and lab measurements, GIS, numerical modeling. So he has a range of tools and range of interests that are very much aligned with this interdisciplinary focus that he's going to talk about right now. So thank you, Alan, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Claudia. That I'm presenting on behalf of a small team, including Eva Sinha, Dalai Hao, Ben Bon Lamerty, our newest members, Balwinder Singh, who has come in since Tim Shippert jumped the fence to explore sometimes greener pastures on the other side of the fence. So I want to first state that E3SM-GCAM is a very novel system. It's unique. It's the only system of its kind. There's only one other modeling group that is attempting to do this. It's the Japan group, and they've just recently started. One of the advantages of our system is that we have this E3SM human component, and it's built in at the same level as the other components. What this means that as we move forward, we can more easily keep the system up to date with other different components as they advance. And we have a supported infrastructure for adding new feedbacks from the human system to the other components. The current state of our system is that we're working with E3SM v2. We're rebased to a branch or a commit that is between official releases. We're thinking about rebasing to the 2.1 release. I took a look at the code. It doesn't look like that'd be too big of a lift. We're currently using GCAM 6, which has been now used quite a bit. It's been out for over a year. And if you're interested, you can look at new documentation that's up on the Confluence website on the HES space. There's information about the implementation of the model, our current progress, how to run the model, and those sorts of things. Current status of the system is that we have the land feedbacks working correctly. Overall, we have both agricultural yields being affected and the land carbon densities being affected in GCAM based on terrestrial productivity feedbacks from ELM. We are still working on it in the CO2 coupled in terms of, and that's a feed forward effect, the CO2 emissions from GCAM into EAM. We're updating the atmosphere configuration to the most current setup so that we can properly distribute our data to all the different levels of the atmosphere. And we're still working on some of the downscaling out of GCAM. We have to do separate downscaling for surface emissions, international shipping, and aircraft emissions. There's still another piece as well that we're working on the land side, and this resolution mismatch between ELM and EHC, which I mentioned before. It's mainly a configuration problem. There's a little bit of coding to update. When we run the land at 1 degree, there's no mismatch. And so for some of our initial configurations, we're really focusing on that configuration until we get the overall mismatch dealt with. I want to stress that GCAM isn't the only part of the E3SM human component, which I'm calling the EHC. I've kind of dubbed that terminology recently. Maybe it'll stick. It's kind of in response, we need to move away from the IAC terminology. So what I'm showing here is how GCAM is its own whole human system. It's part of the human component, but the other part is this interface. And so this human component here on the left on the E3SM is the interface between GCAM and the rest of E3SM. And so this deals with all of the translation between the information coming from GCAM and going into E3SM. Every 5 years, terrestrial productivity is calculated from the land. It's sent to GCAM, and then GCAM projects land use cover and CO2 emissions, sends back to this interface portion, which then does smart translation and determines where to send it, right? So the CO2 emissions have to go to the atmosphere, and the land use land cover have to go to the land. There's a lot more detail under the hood here with this E3SM human component. And so everything on the left of the coupler here is the EHC. And I've been playing around with some of the color coding here. The way that it's broken out now is this rosish color is in one repository. It's in an EHC repository. And then this putty color is actually in the GCAM repository. Part of that has to do with the different languages that these are written in. So on the GCAM side, calculating these feedback scalars to go into GCAM and also downscaling the CO2 emissions are in C++, and they're stored in the GCAM repository. This other code is a combination of Fortran code, so the make surface data, some of this initial downscaling is in Fortran, and then C code. We have a third-party global land use model that's in C, and then our own land use translator that's also in C. So we have different languages going on. We have at least 3 different grids. We have unstructured grids. We have structured grids. So there's a lot going on in the EHC, more than just GCAM. This interface is really critical to make it work. I want to move on to actually configuring and running GCAM, because what we're doing now is trying to figure out proper, valid configurations and what we need to do to get the system running. And so I'm showing here this workflow that we've come up with. First, we need to determine a scenario for GCAM. And scenarios can be your familiar SSP RCP scenarios, or they can be emissions-driven scenarios, which are basically emissions constraints, like the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, or net zero constraints. But we have to think a little bit more about these emissions constraints, because this is more of what we want to do with decarbonization scenarios, but there are some tricky things going on. For one, these generally require carbon capture and storage for the bioenergy component. It's something that we don't represent in E3SM, and so we have to think about, is it okay if we have a little bit of extra emissions in E3SM? This inconsistency has existed for a long time. There have been papers written on total allowable emissions based on their system models versus what's being prescribed by the human system models. So it's not a new thing, but something we have to think about. Another challenge is that while the nationally determined contributions do have land carbon value configuration in GCAM, the current net zero configurations do not, and that's because they have trouble solving. I've heard that there are some people that have done an iterative process to get land carbon value configuration files that do work with net zero. So there's some things we need to think about in terms of constructing our scenarios. It may be possible even, I don't know, that we can have a land carbon value that is enough to meet a net zero constraint without carbon capture and storage. That would take some work. In any case, we have to have the GCAM scenario, and we have to run GCAM. There's some information we need from GCAM before we can run E3SM-GCAM, in particular non-CO2 emissions. Because GCAM in our system, in E3SM system, we're only passing CO2 emissions. So we have to have corresponding non-CO2 emissions already determined. Those need to be downscaled. There are some scripts available to process those so that they're actual EAM inputs. If we're doing an SSP RCP scenario, we also need a carbon price path for GCAM. When GCAM runs and does what's called target finding mode to match RCP 4.5 or 8.5, it runs GCAM over and over again for 100 years to get the right carbon price path to reach that. So if we're doing that in E3SM, we need that carbon price path already before we run E3SM-GCAM. So those outputs need to be processed into the appropriate configuration file, right, for carbon price path, or like I said, the gridded emissions. And we should only need the non-CO2. We can turn CO2 emissions on and off in E3SM-GCAM. So CO2 will come along, but we should always, from a validity standpoint, we should always be able to leave that on in GCAM, but we could use it for testing. Once we have this all set up, we can run E3SM-GCAM. There are a couple runtime options I want to point out in E3SM-GCAM. On the left are some of the Boolean nameless values. I was going to do a screenshot. It wasn't very informative. You can look at those. That's not really the main point. The main point is what's on the right, is what are the things that we can control during runtime in these scenarios that could be very interesting. I mentioned we can turn CO2 on and off. What's more interesting are the terrestrial productivity feedbacks. They can be on, they can be off. We actually have two effects due to these feedbacks. One is agricultural yield scaling, and the other is potential carbon density scaling. The carbon density is for the entire landscape, all land types, and it matters when you have land carbon valued in your mitigation scenario. These can be toggled separately, so we can look at the effects of each individually or together. The other thing I want to point out is that we can run the system with the terrestrial productivity feedbacks off, so GCAM isn't using them, but we still calculate them and write to a file the appropriate scaling values. Then we can rerun the system and read that file back without doing the calculations. And this is important in relation to the broader global modeling community and potentially CMIP7. There's a lot of discussion about how do we incorporate impacts into the scenarios. And the way that it's going to happen in the broader community is that you have previous outputs from an Earth system model and you calculate impacts. And it may or may not be compatible with the scenario you want to run. It may or may not be the specific Earth system model that you want to feed into, but that you have to get your information from somewhere to create impacts for the whole time period, parameterize those in your human system model, and then run that forward. And that's different than what we have here, which is a synchronously evolving system where both the human and the Earth system are responding to each other during runtime. And if you have a changing atmosphere, that can actually affect what those feedbacks and impacts are. And so we can make this comparison. And like I said, this is a unique system. We will be the only team that can do this right now. So I'm going to show some examples, or one specific example, some outputs from that. This is not a scientifically valid configuration. It's really set up to test functionality, and we did it by grabbing available data rather than going through that whole workflow that I just described. So there are some mismatches, but we can show that the system is fully functional on the land GCAM side. Right? So we have an SSV2 socioeconomics for GCAM. We have an RCP 2.6 carbon price path with the full carbon tax applied to the land. We have a data atmosphere that's RCP 4.5. So slight mismatch there, but it's still a future atmosphere. We have both flavors of the feedbacks on from ELM to GCAM. We do have a 2-degree ELM grid and then the static 1-degree grid for the EHC. We have gotten around the mismatch, this resolution mismatch, by creating our own initialization files by running the EHC historically. We're generating this cyclical atmosphere mid-20th century. It's important to remember that as I show you the results. But in this case, so we can test at a lower resolution and have faster runtimes, we created this special initial condition. First, the GCAM scenario changes dramatically in our example. We have a very large increase in cropland, this red line, right at 2000, after 2015. This is 5 million square kilometers. Some increase in harvested forest, a slight decrease in biomass or bioenergy, this purple line. Also in the human system, these big increases come with increases in crop prices on the right. So in the scale, if you can't see, this top line is 60% increase in crop price. The red is oil crops, the green is wheat, but even so, all these different crop types have a considerable increase in price. Human systems responding strongly. There's actually a slight increase in overall CO2 emissions because of that slight decrease in bioenergy land allocation and production. Now, the reason why we have this huge increase in cropland is that we have a large decrease in land productivity. And so these are the globally average scaling values for all of the GCAM crops that are calculated each 5 years. And you can see that these values jump in really low, down to 0.5 even. So much less productive crops, you need a lot more land to do that. And very few of them even get above 1 as time goes on. I want to say these are globally average. There are regional differences as well to these values. Now the reason for this and that's why I pointed out that we have this mid-20th century historical atmosphere. There's a big switch in 2015 in terms of the atmospheric state. This is just a temperature variable. I'm sure the other ones all have interesting jumps as well. We have 281K up to 2014, and then 2015, we have 283K. So this is a configuration challenge. And again, we're working on getting valid configurations, but this does affect our results. Like I said, huge drop in productivity, huge increase in cropland. So let's look more closely at how this information gets back into E3SM. We actually have pretty good fidelity with the cropland area. The total absolute numbers don't match exactly for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of processing that goes on in between these. But the pattern matches exactly, increase and the level of increase over time. And so we say we have good fidelity with the cropland. We have less fidelity with the other land covers. There's a whole set of assumptions that go on in terms of how land is converted from what type to cropland or to pasture as things change, or if cropland or pasture is abandoned. What we're seeing is we get about half of the decrease in ELM of grassland and shrubland that is shown in GCAM. And that's not huge. Like I said, there's a little bit difference in absolute numbers, but what we have is that these allocations in ELM recover back to the no human feedback scenario for both grassland and shrubland. So there's a big decrease and then they start to increase, whereas in GCAM you have a decrease and it stays as a decrease. So there's one slight inconsistency there. This is also apparent in the forest, maybe more apparent in the forest. See, in GCAM you have an initial increase in forest area and a sustained increase when you have human feedbacks. And this has to do with having carbon valued in the landscape. So that's creates an afforestation type signal. In our current model, this is actually more reasonable than it used to be. In integrated earth system model, this afforestation was over 3 times this. So GCAM 6 has actually scaled back on it. GCAM got a lot of criticism for that high afforestation signal. So while this is more reasonable, it's not being tracked well into ELM. You can see we have an initial decrease in forest here, kind of bumps around, and then it starts to recover. And so this has dramatic effects on the carbon response. I'd have to say this is not a new problem. It's something we had to tune the IASM for. In our current land use translator, we have the conversion set up more appropriately for the LUH2 data that we use to generate all of the existing land surface files, so that those look pretty good. We need to look at valid scenarios here to see if we do need to retune this. There are ways to do it. I know exactly what parameters to change to address this particular problem. I don't know if we're going to see similar things in more valid scenarios or not. So we have to look at that. The other point is that you see this is an increase. In GCAM, all of the increased pasture or cropland, parkland in particular, has come from the other land types and not from forests. Right? So it's really this land conversion challenge that we have. We can move more onto the actual ELM outputs. These are the land use related outputs for ELM, and the black is the with human feedbacks and the orange is without the human feedbacks. On the left is a land use flux. We do see a little bit of a spatial reconfiguring between the historical LUH2 data and GCAM's initial projections, and so there's a little bit of a pulse right when you get into 2015. But this big pulse is that huge increase in cropland. So the forest that's lost in particular, and also the shrubland. As time goes on, it kind of recovers and gets closer. On the right, we have the wood harvest carbon from ELM, which largely tracks the forest area. The demand from GCAM is similar. The fractions that are coming through are similar. And so similar fractions applied to different forest area gives you a lot of this differentiation in the actual harvested carbon. Moving on to the total ecosystem carbon in the terrestrial system, what we see here is the singularity 2015, because we have this huge drop in productivity. And so that's where this trailing thing comes off. But we do see what we'd expect from the language change that we have. This orange here now is the with human feedbacks. I guess these are opposite, these two plots. And the green is the without human feedbacks on the left. We have a decrease in vegetation carbon specifically. The soil carbon also decreases but stays. And this is due to largely that forest loss, initial forest loss. And then it recovers. Again, even the shrubland loss and then recovers. The forest loss, it recovers. What we would expect if we were tracking GCAM's forest is that we get an increase in carbon that would be sustained. But it is functioning as the system is configured and it's responding properly. On the right, I'm just showing total water storage. There are differences. So a lot of other different variables do have differences based on these feedbacks. This is just showing that, again, with this singularity, we get this huge loss in productivity. This is a big increase in net ecosystem exchange, which is pretty neutral in 2014, but we lose a lot of carbon here throughout the simulation. There's also an increase in fire associated with this climate singularity shown on the right. And then I also want to point out that regional effects are often larger than global effects in this feedback system. And so this is just showing a differentiation in the vegetation carbon. This dark is greater carbon with the human feedbacks, and the lighter areas, we have less carbon with human feedbacks. It's also something to think about when we analyze these results, that there are a lot of regional effects that are important. So in summary, I want to reiterate that E3SM-GCAM is a unique system, and that we have the land feedbacks functionally correct if our configuration isn't quite set up properly yet. And both models are responding as expected in that case, but we still have some land cover inconsistencies in land conversion translation. Our next steps is that we're going to continue working on GCAM scenario configurations, and we're working on an overall E3SM-GCAM configurations, getting the grids set up, getting a valid spin up with both EAM, ELM, and the EHC running as we anticipate completing our atmosphere coupling. This is going towards our first paper for geoscientific model development, which is our target journal. We're defining this configuration. Like I said, we're thinking about rebasing to a release version of E3SM to do this. And we plan to use SSV2 RCP 4.5 because there are existing data in files, right? To kind of minimize the amount of work we have to do to get to this point. We could use existing EAM input files, for example, for non-CO2 emissions, existing GCAM configurations and files. And again, we need to complete the atmosphere to do that. So this is actually my last slide, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.